Hey, and welcome to The Better Drummer with Zach Covington. I'm Zach Covington. Today we're going to be talking about how to get more interesting comping language into your jazz playing. We're going to use three different methods. The first is using triplets in our snare drum instead of maybe just eighth notes. The second is using our hands together, the ride cymbal and the snare drum together, to get a more interesting flavor. And the third is probably the most important to our growth as jazz drummers, and that is becoming more comfortable with bass drum and snare drum dialogue is what we'll call it. But before we jump into this today, I want to give you all something absolutely for free. It is a PDF that I made called The 5 Jazz Drum Grooves to Get You Through the Gig. Pretty obviously, as the name states, it's going to give you 5 jazz drum grooves that you may or may not be comfortable or familiar with already, so that when you're on a gig or at a jam session or just playing with your friends and they say they want to play a tune that's maybe like a bossa nova, not really sure what a bossa nova is, it'll give you that information so that you'll be prepared for most situations. The first concept I want to talk to you about today is using triplets in the snare drum. Now, I have this exercise that I like to play where I play 4 notes in a measure and I keep them on the same partial of the triplet. Right? So if we think about the triplet, 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet, and we think about each partial, the first partial of the triplet would be 1, 2, 3, 4. The second partial would be 1 trip, 2 trip, 3 trip, 4 trip. The third would be 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet. We're going to play it on the same partial through the measure. So that would start by just playing it on the beats, right? 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet. 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet. Then after we do that, we move it over 1 partial. So to the trip of triplet, right? 1 trip, 2 trip, 3 triplet, 4 triplet. That one's a little bit tough. Then we get to the let, which is a little more natural because it's just like swung eighth notes. 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet. So here's what that sounds like. I'm going to go through and play it just each one by themselves, and then we're going to string it all together. And if you're at your drums, I encourage you to play along with me now. As we do that, we're also going to play the ride cymbal pattern. 1, 2, and 3, 4, and 1. We're going to play the hi-hat on 2 and 4, and we're going to play quarter notes on the bass drum, feathering it nice and light. Let's do it. Now that we've done it with 4 notes in a measure, or 1 note per beat, now we can shift that to 2 notes per beat, or 8 notes in the whole measure. Don't really worry about the whole notes in the measure, just how many we're playing in each beat. So now we're going to play 2 notes within each beat. So we can start with 1 trip, 2 trip, 3 trip, 4 trip. And then we can move to 1, let 2, let 3, let 4, let. And then finally we can move to triplet, 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 like that. Again, I'll play each of them individually, and then I will go back and play all of them put together. The final piece of the puzzle is putting all of those together and being able to play them simultaneously without stopping, which might sound something like this, starting with the 1 note per beat, then going to the 2. Here we go. The final thing with this exercise that I want you to do is speed it up and then mess around with snare drum accents. So accenting the first note of a grouping of 2 or accenting the second note and just playing around and seeing how musical you can make it. So that might sound like this. The second concept we're going to talk about today is a little bit simpler than that exercise we just played. And really what it is playing quarter notes on the ride. And then whenever we play a skip beat, add an extra beat. Like that. We're also going to play a note on the snare drum. So slowly that might sound something like this. This is something that I want you to try out on your own. Start nice and slow and then build up to a more comfortable swinging speed, which might be somewhere around this tempo. The cool thing about that concept is that once you get comfortable, you can weave it in and out of playing the regular ride pattern. So that might sound something like this. Concept number 3 is getting some dialogue between the snare drum and bass drum. This is the jazz drummer's bread and butter when it comes to comping. Once we get comfortable with some different rhythms and variations, the world is our oyster in terms of comping behind other musicians. My personal all-time favorite exercise for snare drum, bass drum dialogue comes from the Ted Reed Syncopation book. I forget which page. I'll put it over here. I know it says exercise 1 at the top. And that exercise that I really like is playing all of the notated 8th notes as a snare drum and all of the notated quarter notes as a bass drum. Now, that is a little bit more advanced than I want us to go, but that's the goal. I want you to eventually get to that point, and I'll make a video on that coming up in the future as well, if you'd like. For now, we're going to go a little bit simpler, though, with that being the goal that we want to reach eventually. We're going to play just 1 or 2 notes per measure on the snare drum, and then that next measure, we're going to repeat what we did just on the other drum. So this exercise is not something that is really notated. This is call and response between your snare drum and bass drum. So this exercise is totally dependent on what you play. But try and limit yourself to, when you're starting out, just 1 or 2 notes. And then once you get a little bit more comfortable, then you can feel free to add in as many notes as you want. But here's what this exercise might sound like. Once you get comfortable with that, trading off measures between each drum, then we can cut that in half and just trade off every 2 beats. So that might sound something like this. Once you can get your brain wrapped around that exercise, you'll find that your comping vocabulary has just immensely grown, and you'll start to be able to play stuff a little bit more challenging. Maybe that sounds like this. Now I'm going to play some time for you and incorporate all 3 of these elements, and hopefully you'll be able to hear each of them individually and then hear how they all play together to make some exciting comping vocabulary. I hope that you enjoyed and learned something from this lesson today. If you even just take one thing from these concepts and apply them to your drumming, your comping skills and your comping vocabulary is going to grow and continue to grow the more that you play. If you like what you saw today, you can hit that like button and the subscribe button as well, as it helps me to feed my sister. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you when you're a better drummer.